I tend to forget to do that. And if I'm looking in different directions, it's because I've got my camera in one place and my computer in the other, so that you can hopefully see what I'm stitching by putting things on my camera. But this is part of a series of classes that I am doing with Kelly Alona for working towards our 20 years in Amtgard next year. So we're doing a class every month. So this is open for everybody, no matter what group you're in. In Amtgard, I am Dame Callandra, and in SCA, I am Lady Serena. And I'm in Anstiora for SCA, Amtgard, Kingdom of the Golden Plains, and Dame Alona is in Kingdom of Neverwinter for Amtgard. And so you guys get lots of classes from us.
Where is that kingdom located?
Neverwinter is in Florida. Golden Plains is in the Texas Panhandle, or West Texas, generally. And I'm in the county of Ravenscross. Yes, that's where I'm from. Okay, and Adlersbrue for SCA, which is the far reaches of the kingdom. But what I'm focusing on here with the showing different stitches with the hand sewing is not necessarily period. Some of it is, but more of it is my knowledge of about 36 years of hand sewing and trying to make things that will last for a long time, as well as things that will hold up to a washing machine. I know that's a concern with a lot of people, that they don't really want to have to hand wash everything, and sometimes it's good, but you can make stuff by hand that will withstand a washing machine and a dryer. It's a little hard to see, but this skirt I had made in about 2007. It has been through the washer and dryer. It is completely hand sewn. It even has it's hard to see, but it has beading and embroidery on it even, and still manages to go through the washing machine. And it is, part of the trick is making sure that you have no raw seams, that everything is completely finished, and that helps. But it is possible to make things last like that. Same with this shirt, was made at the same time, and this is the same thing. It's pretty sturdy on here. So I'm going to start with basic stitch. Also, I do not have a handout because I'm really bad at writing things out, and there are a lot of tutorials that are already out there that are really good that you can look up. One thing to note is stitch names. What I call a stitch may not be what you're used to calling a stitch. There are several names for the same stitch. Also, the way that I hold things, I do have disabilities with my wrist. So the way that I hold things and sometimes do a stitch is what I found works for me. So it may be a slight variation than what you may be used to seeing. And if you have issues with arthritis or tendonitis like I do, it might be a more helpful way for you to do things. It's just what I found that is less painful for me. So it can be adaptive. Basic stitch that everybody will generally start out with is a running stitch. So start by tying a knot on the end of your thread, which I've already done that. I tend to tie 2 knots in the same place. I leave a little bit of a tail so that you can trap the end of the thread into your stitch. And so this one I'm just coming up from the bottom and then just go back down. So this is the basic stitch that most people start off with. Now, you can do this on a seam and it would be perfectly period. However, just on its own, with just doing this in and out like this, it is not a locking stitch. And actually with doing the large stitches that I did, it actually turns it into a kind of a basting stitch, because you can just pull this, and that's actually part of how you make gathers. And you can also just pull it right out too. So what some people will do to make it more lasting is, one, making smaller stitches, but tying a knot every few stitches.
Oh.
Like where I am right now, I put my needle into a little bit of the fabric, and then I've got a loop of thread. It's sticking on the edge, and just make it tying just a little bit of a knot. So that's one thing that you can do. Another is, when you get to the end of your row, you can go back and fill in your stitches. So, which, if you are familiar with blackwork embroidery, it's the same concept as that, the Holbein stitch. And I just unthreaded my needle, so let me get that back on. Okay. So this is actually also called a double running stitch. And that'll make things a little bit more secure. Now, generally you would use smaller stitches, because large stitches like that are usually used for temporary basting, where you would just run a line of running stitch to temporarily secure things, and then you pull it out when you're done. So I don't know how visible that is. I have that last stitch there. And I have to go back to, so my beginning here, I wasn't able to really tack in my thread because I had such large stitches I was using. Let's see. Is this easier to see now that I've got it down into the darkness? Okay.
Yeah, it looks a little bit better.
Okay. So that, and then I would secure that with doing a knot, which you just grab a little bit of your fabric and pull the needle through a little loop. And then I tend to weave my needle back through a couple stitches to help secure things. And then I would do a knot again. Usually on a seam, those would be a whole lot smaller. So that's one thing that you can do. Another is a locking stitch called a back stitch, which I don't know how well you can see that. And then this is the back side of it. And opening up the seam. So with the back stitch, I'm gonna have to tie a new knot here. So back stitch is another locking stitch that will hold up pretty well. It is the main one that I tend to use. So I'm making my stitch here. The next stitch is going to go just in front. I have to hold this a little different way. Okay. So I'm going to pull the needle up in front of that previous stitch I made. This time though, I'm going to go back and put my needle right back at the end of that first stitch that I made. And so then the next one, it comes up in front again, and then you go back to right where you made that stitch before. And that will
I have a question.
lock things in place. Yes.
Are you using a single thread or a double thread?
I'm using a single thread. I may switch to some embroidery thread that might be easier to see. But I am using a single thread. I don't use double threads a lot because I have a habit of one side will end up getting knotted and the other doesn't, and then I have to cut my threads to start. So I find it easier. Now on some fabrics, if you're using heavy upholstery fabric, you do want to use a double thread or a heavier thread, like an upholstery thread, or even sometimes crochet cotton, depending on how heavy of a fabric you're trying to use, because some upholstery fabrics that we often use for court garb and such, a single thread will pull right through it. Like if you try to, no matter how many times you try to knot it, it'll come out and your stitches will tend to break. But I'm just using muslin right now, so I'm just using a single thread. And I'm going to show the backside here in a moment. And I'm trying really hard to make big stitches because I do tend to make very tiny stitches. Because I would really love to try to show you some up close stitches of some garb that I made, but I don't think you'd be able to see it from in the camera. We'll try that here in a bit, but it's really tiny, and I tend to use the same color thread as my fabric. But the back stitch, though, that is my go-to for a long seam or an interior seam. And that'll be a little bit more sturdy, and it won't pull out or pucker as much as with just the running stitch, as I'm pulling on it now, and it's not trying to make the fabric ruffle. Okay. So here's the one that I sewed with the back stitch. Now, when it comes to your seams and finishing them, there's different methods that you can do. And what type of seams you're doing and what type of fabric you're using can make a difference on which method you choose. And so now the term flat felling, that's one of those terms that if you look up, you're going to find several different things showing that of what that is. Most common in modern house hand sewing is flat felling is ironing open the seam. And you have your edges going to both sides. One way that you can do things is you can roll the fabric over. I'm trying to find a good way to do this. I have my seam that's sewn, so I'm just going to roll things over, and you can tack down the side. I've also done where, without doing a line of stitching first, just taking the edges and just rolling it, double rolling it, and then stitching it down. That's one way. Another way is trimming one of the edges so that it's lower than the other one. And be able to fold things over so that you can do another line of stitching without having the bulk in the seam. And so there's some different things that you can do, different stitches for securing a rolled over edge or hemming. So I'm just gonna fold this up a little bit. Okay. Now, if you look up hem stitch, you're gonna find a lot of different examples. I'm going to show you a couple different methods. I have noticed this is where I do tend to do things a little bit different. Let's try a brighter color. Let's see what happens here. Okay. We're going to try the orange, see if that helps. Just a moment. Okay. So, depending on the fabric you're using will make a difference on what type of stitch you want to use on either finishing your seam or your hem. A basic one that most people would be familiar with would be a whip stitch. Normally I would knot my thread, but I didn't do that this time. So I'm just going to tuck it into my fabric a little bit. But if I was making it to last, I would definitely knot it and feed it through some stitches. So in a whip stitch, you're just going to put your needle down right next to the edge of the fold, and you just go over. This is often also called an overcast stitch.
Can you show the camera more directly? We kind of see your fingers. There we go.
Is that better there? Sorry. Hard to do things with the camera.
Thank you.
Okay. So the whip stitch, I'm just going through. I have a very large needle I'm using at the moment. And it just ends up making diagonal stitches. Now that will often show some pretty big stitches on the other side, depending on how you're doing it. So there's some variations with your hem stitches of what you can do. And one of those is as you go to the side here, I'm on the upper part, not where the folded seam is. And just catch your needle in just a tiny little bit of the fabric. And then insert your needle just a little bit in front of it into the fold of the fabric. And pull that out. Now this is the blind hem. So then the next one, I'm just going a little bit, probably about a centimeter or so. Sometimes you may need to do smaller if you have really fine fabric. And just catch a little bit. And then go back into the fold of the fabric and pull it through. Okay. So on the other side, oh, actually let me do one more stitch so we can see it. So you see the fine little dots? It's really hard to see, but this is part of why it's called an invisible hem, because you don't see most of it on the right side of your fabric. But on here, you see right here where the thread is going. Now, if you're using something that's pretty hardy and doesn't fray a whole lot, you can do a lot more. You can put more space between your stitches. If you look at a pair of, if you have any like tailored dress pants, you will often see that they are hand hemmed using this method of the blind hem. And it just leaves the slightest little dot. Another way that you can do this, instead of doing, I was doing a horizontal stitch, is I take my needle perpendicular to the fold. I pull up just the tiny little bit of fabric from the main part of the fabric, and then also catch just a little bit of the fold of the fabric at the same time. And that's a vertical hem of doing it that way. The difference will be in what direction the thread is going to show on the outside of your fabric. And so depending on the grain of your fabric may make a difference on your grain and your bias as far as which direction you want to pull that. So it still shows showing a little dot. It's hard to see, but by doing it the vertical method, it's going to be the opposite direction as doing it parallel to your folded seam. And so sometimes you want to play around with doing a sample piece and seeing how it looks on the outside to decide which direction you want to do your stitch, of which way is going to work better for your project. And so that's 3 methods there that you can do. Now, if you're using a really fine fabric, such as doing a veil or working with some really fine linen, the rolled hem is one way that you would do things. Another thing that you may also want to do is an invisible stitch. And that usually, and it's similar to what I was just doing. It's a little harder to show here, but on that, this is also how you would close up something too. Like if you were doing a padded piece, like for a headpiece or a stuffed animal, is you put your needle in just a little bit of the fabric on one side, and then just inside the fold of the fabric, you pick up another piece, or a little bit, just a little bit of that fabric, just right next to it. So you're making 2 stitches that are right next to each other, but they're on opposite sides of the fabric, and you're pulling it together. Sometimes you may see a ladder stitch. It's a similar concept. So I'm pulling my thread through on my right side first, and now I go directly across to the left side of the fabric and just pull up another piece. And that will hide the stitch completely in your seam.
On the other side?
The other side, you see almost nothing. There's just a tiny little dot. So if you were doing this in, I was trying to make this visible. I'm hoping the orange is somewhat seeable. So if I was doing this
for a second, yeah, the camera will refocus itself. Otherwise, it's kind of blurry.
Okay, does that help?
No.
Sorry. I'm really trying to find a better way. Let's see. Does this help?
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, if only I could just hold and stitch at the same time. I need to work on that. So I'm holding the camera directly above things. Okay, so this is the other side. And there are tiny, tiny little dots. That's how tiny, because you're just grabbing the tiniest little bit, just enough to make it sturdy. Now, you do have to watch it that you do want to make sure you're grabbing more than one thread, because I've done that. And sometimes you can put a hole in your fabric if you're using a really fine fabric and you just grabbed one little thread and it pulls out. So you do have to watch that. And see if I can try to show, I think this might be visible. Let's try this one. Okay, Now let's blue on blue. Is that stitching a little bit easier to see? Okay, so this was done with blind hem. And fairly even, not quite. I kind of have an angle to things. Let's see. This is back stitch. This is one side of it. This is the back side. I don't know. It's gray on gray. That was slightly more viewable. Let me see what I got here. Pretty sure this is not going to be visible. Okay. Actually, this one, I can't even find the stitches when I'm looking at it, so that's not going to show. Okay. And that's linen. Do apologize at that. Now, one thing though, some advantages for doing the hand sewing is one, sometimes you just need something to do and you don't have access to a machine, or you're sitting at an event and it's easier to do that. But there are some things that are actually a lot easier to do by hand than they are with a machine. And gores is one of those things. Because if you ever try to sew a triangle gore with a machine, you know how difficult that can be to get it to not pucker and to not sew the wrong part of the dress to something it shouldn't be. So with hand sewing, it allows you to line things up better. You can get a nice clean point by starting things by hand. You know, sometimes it's good to start it by hand, then you can finish by machine. But it also allows you to do a better finished edge on it too, because it's easier to fold down your seams on here. I know I've got the gray stitching on here. That's actually not what's holding this together. The gray stitching is, well, it's decorative and functional at the same time, but I did actually use a blind hem stitch to stitch down both sides of the fabric. I flat felled on it, and then I did a variation of a feather stitch or herringbone stitch on top of it.
Your embroidery is beautiful. Could we have another look at it, please?
Yes.
Thank you.
So this is my variation of kind of combining a herringbone and a feather stitch together and just kind of making my own way. It's a similar concept. Now this type of stitch, herringbone stitches and feather stitches, are often sometimes called catch stitches. And if you're sewing a knit fabric, this is another way of hemming a knit fabric, hemming that type of fabric, because it will catch the edges. You don't have to fold them under, and helps protect things. But it's fun and decorative too. I would try showing how to insert a gore, but that one I really need a better camera angle and being in person for that. I did want to cover some things about different fabrics. So we've touched on some of that already. If you're sewing a stretch fabric, which is something that in AmpedGuard does happen a lot more often than probably does in SCA, because we do tend to make our sword covers out of fabric that are stretchy and sometimes need to hand sew part of things. But there are some fabrics, such as this cotton gauze that has a bit of a stretch to it, that sometimes you need a little bit of a different stitch. It helps to have something that's got a little bit of give to it. If you look at a sewing machine and you see a lot of sewing machines have some stitches that are in red, those are actually for stretch fabrics. They often do multiple stitches in the same place to allow for more give and stretch. Because if you just do a straight stitch on a stretchy fabric, it can completely stretch it out, or you'll end up with these weird looking puckers. And so doing something that in the once you're done being under the stress of holding it out while you're stitching, you want something that can relax. And that's where I found a chain stitch is a really good thing to do, which is common embroidery stitch that you see, but it has practical purposes. So with a chain stitch, I'm gonna see what I can do here. Okay. So with a chain stitch, I pulled my thread up to the top. To start it, I'm gonna put my needle in just a little bit into the fabric, and I've got this loop in front of it. The first one's always a little bit different. So this is my thread coming up, and this is the loop I put right in front of it. And so the next one, I put my needle down through the loop in the fabric a little bit, but I'm also gonna pull it up just a little bit in front of my stitch. And it goes through the loop.
A blanket stitch.
This one is a chain stitch. Blanket stitch is a little bit different. So you can see there's a little bit of a loop there.
Gotcha.
And on the other side of the fabric, it's going to look like a back stitch or a running stitch. And so I often will put the chain on the inside, but you can put the chain on the outside too, but it'll just look like a regular stitch on the outside. And this is also good if you're doing something like a drawstring casing or for elastic on waistbands, something that needs to be able to have just that little bit of extra give to it. And so that works well on fabric. If you're ever sewing fleece, this is actually a good thing too, because a straight stitch on fleece it'll make one side of the fabric pucker a lot and doesn't lay right. But doing a chain stitch will actually help that lay better on that. So that's my trick that I've learned with that. I don't know how well I can show, because this thing was done almost entirely in chain stitch, but it's all purple on purple. So I don't know if that helps. But they're just tiny little chain stitches. I do make a lot of small stitches. But that's my big hint on that one. And that really made a difference for me because I used to make a lot of peasant blouses with elastic in them back when I was starting things. And let's see. Now blanket stitch, which you were mentioning, I mean, that's another thing, another way that you can do your seam finishes and your hems. Make sure I get this right. Get back over here. I normally wouldn't just go from one area to another, but I'm trying to save from having to make a whole bunch of knots. Okay. So blanket stitch, let's see if I can handle this. Okay. It's similar to the hem stitch that I'm doing the vertical here. I'm putting my needle in just for kind of like the whip stitch and the hem stitch a little bit. I'm putting my needle in through the fabric and going up through the fold, just going straight up through the fold. And there's this loop right here. I'm going to catch my needle in the loop. It'll be easier to see when I get to the next one. Well, blanket stitch buttonhole. I think I'm actually kind of doing a bit of a buttonhole. So that's actually a buttonhole. For the blanket stitch, I've got to do a longer stitch. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to go up about a centimeter into my fabric here, and I'm going to catch that loop. So there are many different ways of doing this. This is just one. So going in here and going up, this is the other side of my seam, and catching this loop here. And that's the blanket stitch. But that one, because we're making big things, is going to show large stitches on the outside. Versus what I was starting to show, the smaller is kind of like more of a buttonhole, where I'm just doing a little bit and catching it, but a buttonhole you would do closer together. So blanket stitch and buttonhole stitch are fairly close to the same thing. Now, some people will do some fancy things and go back through the loop a different direction and kind of make a knot on it. So, I mean, you can go through it this direction, you can go back, you can go through it the other direction. It just depends on what you want to do. Like right there, I'm going to go through the top. I can get it to not catch the fabric. And make a knot and anchor it a little bit. So there's different variations that you can do. It just depends on what you're working with. So if you're working with certain wools, especially something that's been, so if you're working with something that's been felted a bit, like boiled wools or something that doesn't fray or felt, a blanket stitch is a good thing that you can use on the edge of it because you don't necessarily need to do anything to the edge, but sometimes they can stretch out a little bit. And a blanket stitch can help protect that stretching a little bit and help preserve things for you. But you can also just do a little bit of a whip stitch it down. You don't have to fold in your edges. It can get bulky to fold down edges that you don't really have to. Same with fleece. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to fold in that raw edge a whole lot. But a blanket stitch will help preserve the life of that. So, because they can stretch out and start deteriorating a little bit. Now, you definitely don't want to put your wool in your washer or dryer, but just some examples there.
Okay. I do actually have a question from the chat. Lori says, would you be able to just chain stitch along the middle of a folded edge for a hem?
Yes, you could chain stitch on a folded hem. That was actually what I was showing. The bottom of my purple shirt is a chain stitched hem that I just folded over and just did the chain stitch on it. Because that whole fabric is just, I don't know if any of you have ever worked with gauze, but it's kind of a little bit of a mess of a fabric to work with because you've got uneven textures and it stretches. And so the chain stitch is wonderful on that. And that also would work with, if you're doing anything with fleece, that is good too, to do that. And so you can put your chain on the outside and have a decorative finish, or put it on the inside and it just looks like stitching on the outside. So those are actually the main stitches that I use. There are some others that sometimes I may use depending on what I'm doing, specialty things for finishing. But with the hem stitching, back stitch, and chain stitch, you can do pretty much anything you need to do and get things to stay together fairly well. It's just one of those other reasons of why I like to do a locking stitch like the back stitch or do the double running stitch is because if say you put something in the washing machine and it catches a little bit of the thread, if you do a back stitch, it's usually going to be fine. If you just do a running stitch though, even if you've knotted it, a lot of times it can pick up that stitch and pull your fabric and kind of misshape and pull apart your garment. So that's why I prefer the back stitch. Do we have any questions? I know it was a little hard to see some things, but.
Yes, we have one more from Oma Varner. Also, before we are done, could we get a close-up and a little info about your brooches? And yes, I want your brooches.
Oh, my brooches?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
these are from Amazon, actually. I did not make these, but they're like $8 on Amazon, and they're some sort of animal.
They're beautiful.
They were the cheapest ones I can find, and I like them. It's like the one thing I did not make out of all of this.
Those are so awesome.
And oh, I was going to say, and the whip stitch is another thing that's good for using for attaching trim, such as that. Don't know if you can see, but on the inside, a little bit. I have 2 trims on it because I actually made one that accidentally looked like laurel leaves and I didn't know. And so then I sewed a new trim on top of it.
So would I be permitted to make a commentary?
Yes.
It's about knots.
Okay.
People in the SCA, I mean, no one should ever be close enough up to you to see if you knotted your thread before you sew your garment. But if someone sees you sew a garment and sees you make a knot, especially if they're a laurel or a costuming laurel, they'll make a comment that knots were never used in period, blah, blah, blah. You should really secure your thread with 3 back stitches. Now, I know they're wrong. I have been to museums. I have looked at the backs of garments. I have seen the knots. But you know what? Doesn't matter. If you want to enter a hand-sewn piece into competition, you cannot use knots.
And I don't enter competitions, so.
But it's just a fair word of warning for the SCA crowd.
That is helpful to know. I have been, one of the more recent SCA events I went to, which, you know, I don't go to very many because I live in the middle of nowhere, or the edge of the middle of nowhere. And I did, one of the classes I was in for an embroidery was stressing that knots are period and it's okay. So that's interesting to hear.
Well,
that.
I wish the costuming laurels would get the memo.
Dan, I don't know. This was a Eldern Hills event, so I don't remember who it was that was teaching that class, but it was it was a drawn thread embroidery class talking about.
Well, what I do in practice is like a middle ground. I will make a knot just so when I'm making my first 3 back stitches into the back side, I don't lose my thread, but I'll always secure the knot with a few back stitches just in case.
Yeah, that's often what I do, or I make the tail long enough that you can put a needle on it and you can thread it back through the stitch it through the stitches that you've made. But the knot can be a placeholder for when you're starting things and then go and finish it later.
Because I find it really hard to believe that nobody ever made a knot before they pulled the thread through the fabric.
Yes, and I've been told that there are plenty of examples that show that even show that on black work, that it wasn't always identical either. That there were knots, and they did sometimes do backstitch even on black work. So yeah,
I even recall one garment, it just opened up the sleeve and showed the interior of the sleeve, that the interior stitching holding all the trims in place was a mess. My goodness. It looked awful. But you know what? It held together for 500 years, so I guess it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, and sometimes that is. See, I will tell you this, if there are any with Amped Guard out there, an Amped Guard competition is not going to care whatsoever if you knot your thread, but they do care if it's messy. So you do want to make the back as neat as you possibly can. It's one of those things of, I really wish I could show the stitching on my dress a little bit better. I had some pictures of it, but I make very tiny, tiny stitches. And I don't know if this helps with the light a little bit, and you can't really see things. But it was my great compliment when I entered that into a competition, was that they couldn't tell that it was hand sewn and thought it was a machine at first. So that's the goal to aim for on things when they can't really tell.
Well, I'm typically told, not in AMPGuard, in the SCA, that my hand sewing is kind of sloppy and my stitches are too big and placed too far apart, and everything is going to fall apart within 3 wearings. And guess what? None of my clothes have fallen apart.
That's good. Well, big stitches do work too. It
Well,
depends.
I can't see very well, and I also have hand control problems, so I just can't do the fine work.
I do understand that. It's one of the things that I can still do, but sometimes like I understand that because I have trouble holding needles without pain. So sometimes I do use a slightly bigger needle. It makes a difference.
I use huge needles.
That's what I was just using with this. Is I was using a very large embroidery needle, but sometimes that can make it hard to go through the fine fabric. But it was actually, this is the needle I used on the blue dress, so that works. And this is linen.
I don't know if you read The Modern Maker. He's Tyler primarily focused on the 16th century and also a bit of the 17th century, but he gives some hand sewing advice in the beginning of his book, and he suggests using a bigger needle than you think you need to use, just so it leaves a nice big hole in your fabric to prevent twisting of your thread, so then it doesn't knot as easily.
That is helpful, and I do find that that does tend to work with bigger needles, and sometimes it's easier to get a straighter line with a bigger needle. Another trick with straight lines is you could use a water-soluble marking pencil and mark your lines if you want to help. And I actually saw a trick the other day with a class of using plastic canvas to mark holes because it's evenly spaced. And so if you're doing something like pleating, that you just lay the canvas piece, the plastic canvas on there, and then use, like, you can use the prick and pounce method, use a little something to just mark that little dot if you need that to help keep track of where you're going to make things even.
Can I give you a little trick I did?
Yes, ma'am.
I needed something straight. I used painter's tape.
Ooh.
And laid it on the material. It was a thick cotton, but I got a nice straight line.
That's a good way to do it. Ironing does help. I avoid ironing as much as I possibly can. So I actually rarely ever iron my seams. Some people will tell you that you always have to iron them. Well, in period, I don't think that was happening. So,
I have documentation for irons, at least good for the 16th century.
I know for some things, but I know that it wouldn't always be something that they would do with sewing for everything. But there are some things though that do get a better fit if you do iron the seam a little bit, especially if you're doing anything that's curved. But you can also kind of get that effect on your own by gently stretching out the fabric to the curve shape on your own, and as you go and fold it. But,
and there's evidence that while the Norse may not have used irons, they did have bone tools for flattening and opening seams. And at least linen will do what you want to if you apply enough pressure and even heat from your hands.
yes, and for bone tools, well, in leatherwork we still use bone creasers, and they're generally made out of plastic now. But I have used those for smoothing out seams too, especially with some bulky fabrics. But cotton also will tend to do what you want it to do with your hands if you just play with it. When you start getting into polyester though, or silk, satin, no, it doesn't want to do anything. And sometimes that's where you do have to put some basting stitches in to begin with, but you have to be careful with silk because your holes may still be a little bit noticeable when you take out your basting threads. And so that's where the thread that you use makes a difference too. There are some really fine threads that you can get for sewing silk, or use silk for sewing with silk. And as I was mentioning with really heavy upholstery fabrics, you do not want to just use your regular all-purpose thread. You will be very sad because it will probably try to break on you or may just come out of your fabric altogether, because you have to be really careful that sometimes you think you're getting all the way into the fabric and you're just grabbing the tiniest little decorative thread on the top of it and you're not actually sewing things down. So that's where a heavier thread can be helpful with that. Have any other questions? Okay, well, yes?
I'm sorry, I had to unmute. My question is, when you're sewing linen by hand, what is like the best stitches for linen?
So my blue dress that I was trying to sew, I actually did, that is linen. And I used backstitch and hem stitch on it. Pretty much entirely, other than I've got a little bit of whip stitch when I attached my loops that I made for my brooches.
That's the one that has the embroidery you did, right?
Yes.
Oh, that is gorgeous embroidery.
And that, as I said, did actually have a purpose to it also, because it helps protect the seam. So that if my back stitches that I have, if they come undone, well, that embroidery is still going to keep it together. It's not going to fall apart.
I like what you did there. That's really cool. Thank you.
Thank you. This is what I did between calls when I had very low call volume at work recently. But trying to see. And then also invisible stitches that I was trying to show. That's what I used on the straps. You really can't really see it, which is kind of the point. But that's instead of, because sometimes with straps and things like narrow pieces, it's really hard to turn them, you know, when you try to sew it inside out and then try to turn it right side out. So an invisible stitch is another way to do that. So I didn't do this inside out. I just folded in on both sides and then did invisible stitches to close it, to sew it up.
They make fantastic tube turners, which is basically a tube with a stick, and you put the tube inside of what you're trying to turn, and then you use the stick to push the what you're turning through the tube, and it takes like 2 seconds.
Those are good. Those are some things, and I've done that. Sometimes, though, I found that when I have really narrow things, sometimes it's still too difficult for me. So then I find this easier. But tube turner things are really nice. Or sometimes you can sew a piece of cord into the end of the seam and be able to pull it to pull things out. Is another method to do with that. Okay, okay, do we have other questions?
I've been reading a fair amount about pick stitch, how it was used by Norse people to secure certain areas of garments like necklines, cuffs. It sounds like really a gigantic pain to sew this pick stitch. Have you heard about it?
So I was looking at some diagrams of that earlier today, and I really couldn't figure out how different really that was than some of the other hem stitches. That on the outside it looks about the same, but I would have to look at some directions better on it. But just the diagram I was looking at looked similar to other stitches.
I was under the impression that it was like a very, very tiny running stitch.
Okay, that makes sense there. It's like, it looks like it. I would have to look at it more, because that was the first time that I saw it, was when I was looking at things today, was the pick stitch. Sometimes though, some of those where you see it's just a tiny little stitch is some variation of a type of hemming stitch. As I said, they have a lot of different names, but it's the thing where you're just grabbing a little tiny bit of the fabric that's being visible on the outside, and then the majority of what you're sewing is being caught by the folded seam on the inside. And say pick stitch, catch stitch, slip stitch, ladder stitch, they're all kind of similar variations of the same concept. It's just different methods of how much of the fabric you're grabbing at once, what angle you're coming at from it, and what part of the seam that you're catching it with also. Like whether it's the inside of the fold itself, or the outside of the fold.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, any other questions?
I do, but it's unrelated to your class. Is that the belt that I made you hanging up over there behind you?
Yes, the one you made and the one that Mara made are both hanging on the wall.
Okay. Forgot that existed.
By the way, we should convince Kelly to teach a leatherworking class sometime soon because she is a wonderful leather worker.
No.
Which I'm actually going to show it off since you mentioned it.
And I no longer have a working right arm, so maybe not.
So this wonderful, so in Amtgard, our arts and sciences peers are called Serpent Knights, and that's what I am in Amtgard. And so this is a big serpent. And then she sewed this knight, and I realized I had the serpent's head upside down. But this is Kelly's work, and it has a stone in it.
Ooh.
And thank you. All right, you have any other questions? Okay, well, thank you all for joining me tonight. If you do have questions, you can send me a message. Miranda Moore on Facebook. I'm generally available for things. And as I don't get out to events very often, so online is usually the best way to reach me. But occasionally I make appearances in Bonwick and Eldron Hills.
Thank you for offering this class. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And Amtgard wise, I generally make it out to Golden Plains sometimes.
Yes, thank you very much for the class. I appreciate it over here. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. Have a good night.